So now you're 400 years ahead of us. So don't say to me, oh, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You didn't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You pulled yourself up on the backs of my ancestors, off my grandfather's bootstraps, off my great grandfather's bootstraps, off my father's bootstraps.
America, we have come so far, but there's so much more to do.
I have a dream today. We do not want our freedom gradually, but we want to be free now.
We did not secure the right to vote for ourselves to even 50 years later.
I think the important thing was that we got our gay rights all across America, across the world.
Senator Kamala Harris will be the first woman and the first woman of color to become vice president.
But still like dust, our eyes.
Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Freeish Season 2, a podcast in which we have tough conversations about race in our college, community, and the country at large. Today, we'll be honoring the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., while being careful not to co-opt his legacy to promote toxic positivity that can be harmful to the cause that he so vehemently worked toward: absolute freedom for all Black Americans.
Before we begin, I want to warn you that this podcast will include descriptions of difficult moments in history and the news. We want to be honest with you, and that requires us to be open about our biases from the beginning. We are weird. That is, Western, educated, live in an industrial-sized country, rich when compared to the rest of the world, and are vocal because we live in a democratic society. Chances are you are also weird.
However, that does not mean that we won't disagree sometimes. In fact, we encourage you to think long and hard about the things you may not agree with us on. What we want to do with this podcast is continue to have the conversations we begin to have in the first season, but at a much deeper and granular level. Let's be clear. Our views do not necessarily reflect those of Valencia College, but we are very happy to know that we are working tirelessly to advance the causes of equity and equality for Black students within our institution every day. That being said, let's take a look back.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. proclaimed, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," from a jail in Birmingham, Alabama in April 1963. Last year, the world witnessed a country at odds, divided, each side searching for answers, but both searching in different ways. Cries for justice rang out in the streets, but for some in America, the cry was ignored.
The world slowly watched in horror as the life of another Black man was unjustly snuffed out by the knee of a police officer. The gasps of George Floyd were gasps heard and felt across the world. Today, we acknowledge the gasp of the disproportionate amount of Blacks dying due from COVID-19. We acknowledge the gasp of the disproportionate amount of Black essential frontline workers in harm's way. We acknowledge the gasp of those hurt by a Confederate flag that embodies a symbol of racism. But we also stop to take a breath after the inauguration of a new president who doesn't desire to stoke the flames of discord, but aims to strum the harp of harmony to console a broken nation.
These recent events aren't the only reason we are here. In fact, we're here to talk about the long history of the vicious cycles that keep Black people, like myself, underemployed, underinsured, and living under a system that has failed us numerous times. And I'm so glad to get into this conversation with all of you guys here. And for the viewers, we love you and we can't wait to get into what we have with us today. As of 2018, the Black uninsured rate has reached 11.5% in the nation. And this number has grown in the wake of the pandemic. And I want to give a quick story about a man named Darius Settles. He's a 30-year-old who died from COVID, and he died on the 4th of July in Nashville, Tennessee. This was a young Black man who had been to the emergency room, and he was sent home from the emergency room for the second time. And something that he worried about were his medical bills. And it just so happened that he was uninsured. He used to play the organ at his church, and he was creating his own designing company for clothes. And during the time right before his death, he was very concerned about the medical bills that he'd have to pay for. And he was sent home. And when he was sent home, he ended up dying. If he had possibly stayed in the hospital, he would not have died. And I think this is a big problem with those that are uninsured within the nation, because the statistics will tell you. I'll give you a statistic right here. It's found by the Kaiser Family Foundation that 1 in 5, 20% of uninsured adults say that they went without needed care in the past year because of the cost, in comparison to 3% of adults with private coverage and 8% of adults with public coverage. So there's a problem here. There's a problem with people who are not insured having good medical coverage and being handled well with the healthcare system. And that's a problem. And it's a really big problem when these are Black people who are disproportionately being affected by this. And honestly, I would love to get you all's feedback on this. And are there any stories that you've heard or some anecdotal experiences that you've heard of?
I think unfortunately we all know someone or have been affected personally or have a family member being affected by lack of insurance. It is a problem that has plagued the United States since the beginning. When you tie healthcare to employment, it's criminalizing poverty. Black people are just extensionally underemployed, underinsured, and undereducated. So you add that with also being prone to heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, it's a powder keg of disaster. Throw in a global pandemic and we're getting wiped off the face of the planet.
I totally agree with you. I 100% agree with the sentiments. And something else that I think is important to look at in regards to Blacks that are being affected by them losing their jobs today is that a lot of Blacks are suffering from unemployment. And when I look at the unemployment rate, I looked at some of the statistics, and during the second quarter of 2020, the Black unemployment rate was 16.7% in comparison to the white unemployment rate, which was 14.2%. But now it's a little bit different going into 2021 because as of December 2020, they were lowered. So the white unemployment rate right now is 6%, but for Blacks, it's 9.9%. That's 10%. 1 in 10 Black people in the nation are unemployed. How does that not criminalize being unemployed when you cannot afford to have insurance coverage? And for those that do seek to be covered for their COVID medical bills, you will be covered. But for people who don't know, the hospitals are not required to tell them. So they may be scared to even go to the hospital in the first place to receive any type of treatment. People who don't have insurance are less likely to go to the doctor to get checked up on. And that is the case, sadly, for a lot of Black people here in the nation who do not have insurance coverage. Because of that, when you go to the hospital, they get sick. When they do get checked out, they're later along the path of sickness that their body's been stricken with. And unfortunately, Blacks die because of this every single year. And in fact, every single day. It's something that's really sad. And I think it's something that this nation as a collective needs to deal with, because this is a problem for Blacks. And I think a big problem in this is because people are afraid to go into debt. They don't want to go into debt to save their lives because they think about, oh, my kids, they'll have all this debt and it'll be in my name and I can't afford to go to the hospital. I can't pay for my kids to go to college. I can't pay for them to do this and that. I think the nation needs to go out on a limb here. A lot of people would not agree with me. A lot of people wouldn't, but I have no problem with some form of debt forgiveness for those people who have these medical bills.
Absolutely. I agree with you. And I think that it's a shame. And another thing that we need to touch on is the underinsured. So yes, there are African Americans and people of color that have insurance, but the copays and the minimums they're still preventing. Like you said, they're further along in their illnesses. They're not worried about health, they're worried about money. And that's sad, because if you come to the point of where you're paying for your mortgage versus your insulin, you know, the house is going to be there, but unfortunately you won't be living in it. But
Right.
then you won't be able to buy your insulin if you're living under a bridge either. So it circles back over and over again.
It shouldn't have to be a choice that people make of, oh, am I going to send my kid to college in a few years, or am I going to take my kid to the hospital, or I'm going to take myself to the hospital? That shouldn't be a choice that anyone is put in that situation.
And the sad thing is that a lot of Blacks are put in that situation because a lot of Blacks are having to be the ones on the front lines. It's stated that the Black community is paying a high price, while their lives, Black lives, are 2.8 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than whites are. And this isn't just because we're more susceptible to it because we're Black. So if you get Black, you get COVID. But a lot of Blacks are having to work on the front lines. Today, the Black worker is a greater risk of contracting COVID due to 17% of African Americans in the workforce being on the front lines. And 26% of those within the 17% are in public transportation. Imagine that, you being in a national pandemic, not national, a worldwide pandemic, and you're working in public transportation, and you're an essential worker. So you need to go to work. You're essential. The nation needs you to perform whatever task you're performing in the field in terms of transportation, and your life is in jeopardy with hundreds of people going in and out, or so many people just going in and out of a train car or a bus. I mean, this is something hard to reconcile within the nation. And I think this is going to be a problem as we continue to continue to go into this year of 2021. And I think this is something that needs to be solved. And you have something to say, Anjanette? Go ahead.
No, I would just wanted to say that when you kind of touched me personally when you brought up the frontline workers. My dad is a bus driver. He has been my entire life. He drives for public bus in Massachusetts, and he's in that age range. He's at risk, and I think about it every day. And yes, they've taken precautions, but still he can't call off, because then nurses don't get to work and frontline workers don't get to work. So he's essential. And it's scary. It's a scary place to be in right now. I think the medical system needs a complete overhaul when it comes to African Americans and people of color. We're disproportionately underdiagnosed. Black women, it is the most dangerous time in a Black woman's life is to give birth in this developed nation. We are I believe it's like 13% more likely to die in childbirth versus our white counterparts. Autoimmune diseases are less likely to be diagnosed. Cancer treatments, there's biases built into organ transplant.
Yeah.
With creatine levels and many other facets of racism are systematically involved in the medical field, and it's sad. And we're not saying that doctors or nurses are racist. It's these things are being taught in classes. These things have been written in books. And unfortunately, no one double checks this. So it keeps going on. Black women are up to 4 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related complications. That's insane to me. In a developed nation, women have been given birth since the beginning of time. We should have it down to a science at this point.
You're so right. No, I agree. It should be down to a science. And it's unfortunate that a lot of Black women, Black families, let's just talk about the family, because the family is so crucial in determining the outcome of those that are growing up, the young of this nation. And something that I do like that the country had put forward was the CARE Act. I do appreciate what they did to help the American people by giving out checks. The first one, I believe, was $1,400. Am I right, guys? It was $1,400. Then there was the $600 that came a little bit later.
$1,200. 1,200
1,200.
for adult and 500 for children, for dependent children up till 16. So there was a huge gap with college students over the age of 17 and or adults who are claimed as dependents, such as like the cognitively disabled, those in home, the imprisoned. So there was a huge gap that was left out of a range of people um, in the first stimulus. And the second stimulus, I believe those same conditions applied. And the second one was for 600 for everyone, even children.
Yeah. Did you have something to say, Natalie? I saw you unmute yourself.
I was just going to say that age range, which is that college age, like those are the people that are going to college in a system where college is so expensive, and that's a whole other topic. And then we're even going to school in so many places to be taught in a system that's systemically racist. So we don't have the money to go to this education that we're needing to go to, and it's just so many flaws.
And that's a sad thing, and that's a problem that we have in the nation. And what I've seen that Joe Biden is doing, he just released his COVID relief plan. If you all haven't seen it, look it up. It's on CNN, Fox, any news outlet. It's online. And something that he highlighted was that he was aiming to help stimulate those that have been stricken with poverty, especially those within the Black community, people who need rent relief, who need paid family leave, and access to affordable health care. And I think that's I think this could truly be a turning point. It's not going to fix all of the problems, but it's a step in the right direction within the nation. I really do. And we're in a really dark time right now in regards to the pandemic and education, with a lot of kids being at home. I have a little sister who's at home, and it's kind of hard for her to stay on top of her work with her just being in a different mode of education, something she's not used to. And I just think this is something that our nation just needs to work on. And I think we're heading in the right direction. So to get to the next thing that I wanted to talk about, I was referring to essential workers on the front line, and the Black people that are on the front line just aren't on the front line for fun. I mean, there's a reason why they're there. There's been a lot of essential Black workers because there's a problem in this nation. A lot of people would scream it's an income problem. I would beg to differ. Income problem is a problem, but it's a symptom of a wider problem, and that has to do with wealth inequality, the wealth that you accumulate during your lifetime and pass on to the generations after you. And if you do not know the difference between wealth and income would be the money that you generate throughout a year, throughout your lifetime income. But your wealth is something a bit different. It has to do with the assets that you own in your name. These assets are things you can liquefy, can turn into cash. If you have a home, you can sell it. If you have stocks, you can sell them and turn it into cash. These are things that many Blacks are lacking with there not being many Black homeowners here in the nation today. So I just wanted to highlight that really quick. Anjanette, I'm sure you have something to say. What do you think about the issue with wealth inequality?
Wealth inequality is huge, and there's a huge problem. And I think wealth inequality affects all of us. I definitely believe it has become like an oligarchy with wealth hoarding. There's the 1%, and then there's the rest of us. I know when I was growing up, I'm a little bit, I'm older than you guys, that there was middle class. I feel like the middle class is gone. People are 1 to 2 paychecks from disaster. There was a poll done at CNN, and they asked 100 families, could you afford $1,000 emergency right now? Could it $1,000? Now we all know $1,000 is a drop in the hat in 2021. $1,000, whether it be a car, your car breaks down, or you have to come up with this money from a behind bill, roof, anything. And somewhat of like 78 families could not do it.
Wow.
So when you talk about systematically, when you talk about generational wealth, well, that's all, something that definitely plagues the African American community. When we were not allowed, when we created wealth, we worked the land. Let's keep it real. Slavery was brought over here. This country was built off our backs. The South was empowered to succeed from the Union because their labor was free. Now you think about, with all that wealth and all those plantations and all these homeowners who didn't have to pay their laborers, how far ahead of the game are they?
Right.
There's a viral video of Miss Washington, and she breaks it down so eloquently. So we have 250 years of slavery. We have 100 years of Jim. So you're 250 years ahead of us in the game. You're allowed to collect. You're allowed to go around the board. You're allowed to buy property. You're allowed to build on that property. You're allowed to farm that property. And we do it for you. And you don't have to pay us. So you're 250 years ahead of us. Then we are free-ish. Okay? So then we go out and we create towns like Roswell and Tulsa, and we build. And then you burn it to the ground. And you use eminent domain. Then there's Jim Crow. So now we can't vote. We can't own property. We live in certain areas of town that you say is okay. We're still working for you. We're still raising your children. We're still cutting your grass. We're still mowing your lawn. We're still picking your cotton. And you pay us pennies on the dollar. So now you're 400 years ahead of us. So don't say to me, oh, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You didn't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You pulled yourself up on the backs of my ancestors, off my grandfather's bootstraps, off my great-grandfather's bootstraps, off my father's bootstraps. I know we've heard the arguments, and let me say this disclaimer very quick, very, very clear. Trump is not the problem. Trump is the symptom of a disease that has plagued this country since its creation. Since colonizers came over here, that it has always been this way. Trump just made it publicly okay to be racist, as we saw on January 6th and many other times. So to say to people of color, to say to immigrants and say, oh, pull yourself up. Nobody gave me anything. Nobody had to give you anything because your family already had it. Your house was passed to you. Your name was, the relationships, the mergers and the classrooms, and they allowed to be in a classroom.
Right.
That was handed to you. You were already 17 steps ahead of me before I was born. And racism, unfortunately, racism and bias and prejudice is built into every single aspect of American life. We've heard the straw man arguments. We've seen the posts. We've heard the, race is a social construct. Race is a social contract, but it's upheld.
I think, just to add in there real quick, I think such an argument I hear all the time from white people is, well, we all have the choice. Like, we're making the choice. Like, we've come from hardship, or they're just not making the choice, which is so false. And then just hearing you speak and continue that and like point out the actual facts, like that's not something we're just making up to prove our point. Like, those are actual facts of the choice that I have in front of me are not the same choice as everyone has. So that argument of, well, they can just make the choice. Like, no, that's not it.
I think we've all held those. We've heard those in classrooms, with our peers, and you see them and you wonder, like, what is it that I'm seeing that you're not?
Something that I would point out, something that I think is groundbreaking that people, I don't think, pay enough attention to today. There's something called the K-shaped recovery. And if you think about it, just I'll do it with my fingers. It's a K. It's like that. Then there's one part going down. So the part that's going up is technology and large capital firms. There's a lot of firms, a lot of big companies that are getting richer, even in the pandemic. I'm not hating on them right now. That's not what I'm doing. But I want to point something out. These big companies are getting richer even during the pandemic, but the people, the middle class workers, those that are in the middle class, that are in the lower middle class and people in the poverty line, they continue to get poorer. And a lot of the people that are in these categories that are getting poorer, small businesses, low income blacks, low income whites, low income everyone. But I wanted to point out that blacks are a big part of the portion that is going down within this K-shaped recovery. So it's not much of a recovery. It's, if anything, it's the downturn for those within the Black community, with a lot of those within the white community not having to suffer. As I'm not saying white people don't suffer from poverty. I'm not saying that. But not at the same level as a collective people, as Black people. As I said earlier, 9.9% of Blacks are suffering unemployment. 10%. You pick 10 Black people out right now, one of them is unemployed. That cannot happen within this nation. I think it's important that we look to reinvigorate the workforce here in America. We can't sit here idly by and just continue to have a low or really high unemployment rate for African Americans.
There's a bill that just got voted on in November, to raise the Florida minimum wage. And the people that were saying no, that's not a good thing. It goes back to that. You have to have enough money to feed and to live. Our economy is not going to be better. Our problems are not going to get fixed. If you see America and there's problems in America, those problems aren't going to fix themselves when people don't even have enough to survive. And so maybe as an actual thing, we have the minimum wage in Florida being raised, but what about a federal minimum wage raise? There's still places that they're raising the minimum wage, but it's by 30 cents a year. That's not going to make a difference. And yeah.
No, you're absolutely 100% right. Florida raised their minimum wage. I think it went from $7.46 to $7.63.
Mm-hmm.
It's insane. And supposedly it's supposed to be going, but that is one of President-elect Biden's, is to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour.
I think something we can point out really quickly before we get on to our next topic is I think we need to make sure that we're looking out for those who are working those minimum wage jobs. Because when you go to McDonald's now, as my dad would say back in the day, it was nothing but teenagers. It's a whole bunch of kids working at McDonald's. But that's not the case today. There's people who are suffering from the economic depression that the country was in during COVID-19. There's people who have lost their jobs. And I mean educated people who have to work some of these jobs for a certain time. And we have to think about them because some of these people have families. So how are we going to help them in regards to their families? Childcare is a big thing. Childcare is expensive. My mom told me how much it costs to send a kid to daycare when you have a child. I almost cried. I'm like, I'm not having any kids. It costs too much. But I could never even think to do that. And I think it's an unfortunate circumstance people find themselves in when they're just trying to take care of their own. Going to work is not enough. They have to pay an exorbitant amount of money for childcare.
Yeah, and if that's a fear of, because I've thought the same thing almost, of I don't want to have kids because it's gonna cost so much money where I'm just gonna be trying to pay for myself. And then also just that thought of, if the system doesn't change, my kids may have same good opportunities I had, but if they're growing up in schools that are teaching the same thing that I was taught, I don't want them in those schools. I don't want them to have to come home from school and I have to be well, all this stuff you were taught is actually false. The thought of that, if things don't change,
Oh, welcome to my life. I'm always like, that's not quite what happened. But as far as like childcare and teenagers being at McDonald's, your father's completely right. One of my first jobs in high school many moons ago was I was a cashier at McDonald's, and I think the manager was 22. Now you see women with women and men that have whole families, like married, because what these jobs were supposed to be after school jobs, Sonic and Publix and all these places have turned into careers because you can't go anywhere. And I seen a statistic not too long ago about how stay-at-home moms are now back on the rise, but they're back on the rise because her paycheck would go to childcare, so she might as well just stay home.
Right.
Because what you're paying taxes to send your kids to daycare, because literally that's all you would make. And it's true. Childcare is exorbitant amount of money, especially if your child is still in diapers.
No,
You're
you're
talking hundreds of dollars a week for one child. Okay, well, stopping here is a great point to transition over to our next topic. Natalie, do you want to take it away?
Hey, sure. So, and to finish that conversation, going back to Dr. King, we've talked about economics and just how this system we're in is really unequal. And going back to a quote he said, if peace means a willingness to be exploited economically, dominated politically, humiliated and segregated, I don't want peace. Which is we have people who are calling for peace, but those are the same people who are supporting a segregated system. And where that segregated system and those same people will get brought up in this next part, which is our open letter. And here it is. Dear South that raised me. The Grand Old South is an affectionate nickname for what was the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy was made up of 11 states, which seceded from the United States of America and formed a country that lasted for 5 years. Although it was officially dissolved over 150 years ago, the symbol of the Confederate flag is still present in the South. I used to not think much of seeing a Confederate flag in someone's yard or on a bumper sticker, but located on I-4 heading to Tampa for 12 years was a 30-foot by 60-foot Confederate flag. This flag left me unsettled when I rode by it as a kid. It didn't make sense to still have a flag around that represented a country that had barely existed and then stopped existing because they lost in a war. The country it represented was a country that fought against other Americans so they could own people. And that wasn't right. But as I grew up, the narrative changed to a false one. People told me the Civil War wasn't about slavery and instead was about the states' rights and small government versus big government. Slavery was just the breaking point. But this narrative diminished what rights the states were fighting for. They were fighting for the right to own people, the right to own people but treat them like livestock. These people who needed the same food, who breathed the same air, and who deserved the same rights were treated like animals. They were sold, worked, bred, and killed whenever it was convenient for the master. Picking and choosing what to remember from history, just because it is comfortable and convenient for you, is lying and dishonors the memory of the people on both sides of the war. The Confederate soldiers were in direct opposition to the United States of America. But for too long, the people of the South have been praised for their beliefs and what they were willing to fight for. Choosing to believe the South was a righteous place of American values and ignoring what they really valued erases the truth. After all this, maybe you're not convinced to take down your Confederate flag you won't, because I'm just a radical young girl who hasn't studied history and is too caught up in a movement to understand the facts. If this is your belief, then I would encourage you to rethink the flag, not from a historical position, but from a position that values humanity. If you are white, you might see it as a grand old flag. If you are Black, it is a flag of oppression and a reminder that you live in a country that glorifies the treatment of owning and killing people like you. The flag communicates the message that this is our space and we don't want you in it. This message was made clear in 1861 when Mississippi justified their secession by stating, and I quote, "The Union advocates Negro equality socially and politically and promotes insurrection and incendiarism in our midst," unquote. Mississippi did not want things like, back to the quote, Negro equality, end quote, in their state. This same message of hate was made again very clear when the flag was paraded through the Capitol building during a riot on January 6, 2020. It doesn't matter if this message isn't your intention. You must realize that for your neighbor, your coworker, your classmate, your professor, your in-law, maybe even someone you call a friend, sees that flag and is reminded of a country standing on the foundation of hate, bigotry, and wickedness. The heritage you see isn't one of love, but of hate. Sincerely, a white girl who does not accept the Confederate flag.
Wow, that was wonderful. When listening to you tell it from your point of view, all I could think of is like all history should be remembered, but not all history should be celebrated. When you look at the Confederate flag, you cannot ignore that it's connected to slavery, to lynching, to racial oppression, to segregation, to stealing, to sexual assault, to murder, to terrorism, and the overall hate of the Black race. As we look to not only what has transpired, but to the future, we look to tomorrow, which is within our reach. So we don't have to sit back and gasp any longer, but stand with the newly elected president, Mr. Joe Biden, and vice president, Mrs. Kamala Harris, to send a message of justice, peace, and unity to our nation. Racism was not 200 years ago. It resurfaces itself in our systems, and now we see it with Trump supporters storming the Capitol because they did not get what they wanted. It looks just like the Ku Klux Klan without the hoods. On January 6, 2021, a mob of armed domestic terrorists waving Confederate flags, encouraged and provoked by the former president, stormed into the Capitol building with the intention of kidnapping and attacking Vice President Michael Pence. They broke down windows, stormed through police barriers, created total chaos, and erupted violence over the electoral confirmation that Joe Biden legally won the election. A gallows was erected across from the Capitol, meant for Mike Pence and to be used later for Kamala Harris. Rioters were then met with a completely different reaction from police versus the Black Lives Matter movement protests all over the summer. This is a part of the problem. In order to heal as a nation, we must address the racist past, policies that are still separatist, and give voice to the marginalized. If we continue to silence and ignore the actions of those around us, this event will not be singular. When defending the police is exclaimed by people of color and other marginalized communities, it is not a battle cry to dismantle law and order. Defunding the police is simply reevaluating where federal spending that is earmarked for law enforcement is really going to. How that money could be better spent to prevent crime and aid those once involved in the justice system. Police are a needed entity in any community, but so are social services, such as education, with emphasis on early education, mental health services, and drug treatment facilities. If we take a fraction of the millions spent on law enforcement each year and funnel those funds back into the communities, society would have less need for police. Crime may never be eradicated, but it certainly could be reduced significantly. Studies have shown that when education and social services are put as a forefront of a community, crime is naturally reduced. Society answered back, Blue Lives Matter. That was the response from so-called patriots chanted to defund the police. What is a blue life? Is that a box you can now check on applications when establishing race? No, it is not. Blue lives do not exist. Blue shirts exist, and they exist solely as a part of a uniform. The uniform of a job an individual chose to do. I will never discount the job law enforcement does each and every day. But being a police officer is still a choice. Being born Black in the United States is not. Blue Lives Matter was just another way to avoid acknowledging the racial disparities that continue to plague this country each and every day. If Blue Lives Matter to so many, where was the concern on January 6, 2021? This is another straw man argument used to deflect responsibility and promote white privilege.
I just wanted to say, first off, thank you so much for explaining that. There was so much last summer scrolling through Instagram. There were people that were saying, yes, defund the police, and other people saying no. And I was like, I don't know what this means. And I couldn't find something that actually made sense. Everything was saying something different. But that explanation is what people need to be hearing. They need to hear that this is not, we don't want there to be police officers. It's no, we want there to be police officers, but also other people who are more specifically trained for a person's needs. So just, I want to say thank you for putting that in such a way that anyone can understand.
Thank you. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. So I do want to still illustrate a little bit more what defunding the police would look like. So what the police are tasked right now with keeping peace, dealing with domestic violence, homelessness, mental health crises, overdoses. It is so many bags and so many burdens on the police when their total priority should be law enforcement, maintaining the peace. So for me, what defunding the police will, and I'm speaking completely for myself, it would be into retraining. Though I do believe, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed, is that the police do know how to de-escalate a situation. We saw that with the Capitol riots, one person and one person only was shot by the police. So they do, and at no point in time do I ever want people, any person, regardless of the color, to be harmed. We don't want you to start shooting white people. We want you to not shoot us like you don't shoot them. That being said, so defunding the police would be, say the police get $1 million a year. We know that this is just not the number, but just for easy numbers, say the police are given $1 million a year. So if you take 1% of that and you retrain the police force and non-lethal, they use their billy clubs, they tase, they de-escalate, they call in for support, however it looks like in that each situation, but we retrain the police. We put money into more body cameras that cannot be shut off by the police. We put it into cameras for the cars, all that kind of retraining to keep, they go back to being partners again, where two police officers ride together. So if there's, one that's kind of getting, there's one to de-escalate, one to support, support. And then we take, 2%. and we put in drug treatment facilities. And now if there's a drug crisis, whether it's an overdose or just a person that's looking to self-harm or harm somebody else, you call in those people and they take care of all drug issues, whether it's someone that's looking for drugs, all these things that have been criminalized. We take all of that and we put that where it goes. And then we have homelessness, which we know the jails are full of homeless people because sleeping on a park bench is illegal. So once we change ideas of criminalizing poverty, we get homeless shelters and work programs and and things of that nature to eradicate that problem. So the police no longer handle that. You dial another number. And then, there's domestic violence and child issues and stuff like that. So then we get social services to come in and social workers. And they come in and they handle those issues. And then we have seen mental health crises. A gentleman was killed on his porch not too long ago, an unarmed Black man who was in the middle of a mental health crisis. We've seen right here in Central Florida a few years ago where the caretaker was actually shot because a young boy that had autism was having a meltdown in the middle of the street, and unfortunately the caretaker was shot. We all know these stories. We all know their names. It's very sad that we continuously feel that. So now, if we have trained mental health professionals, and as someone that has been trained and was a mental health nurse for many, many, many years, it takes a special kind of person to de-escalate, and it takes lots of training to deal and combat, to walk towards someone being violent and come out okay. And I don't think someone with a gun necessarily needs to be that person. So we would have those being taken care of. And then we would also have like community issues. Like, so instead of having like, we would have parks for teenagers to go and ride their skateboards so they're not getting in trouble for riding on the streets. We all see the Karen videos. We all know the meme. We've all seen them, and juvenility is kind of being criminalized as well. So we want these things to be taken care of. So there would be boys and girls clubs and affordable childcare, things that all the police are handling now and they're being overworked and overstretched, and it's leading to bad decisions, not taking away the blame at all because they have to bear that, but to prevent it. So if we take those burdens and we juggle them throughout the community to train professionals in each field by taking away a little bit of the police budget, I'm all for it. How do you guys feel about defunding the police?
Yeah, I just wanted to say real quick, you mentioned teens and then you mentioned just even like the system of police. And I remember last fall, I was working on a photography assignment and I just needed to go take some pictures at night. And I am a girl, so I know there is no way I'm stepping outside by myself, probably ever, but especially nighttime. And that's something that I have had instilled in me. So I was like, I just called my brother up. My brother is 6'3". I'm 6 foot tall. It was like 9:30, kind of cold. He's wearing a hood. We're walking through a neighborhood. I'm stopping to take a picture. And 3 police cars drove by and stopped at a stop sign nearby. And I remember thinking, okay, that's something, whatever. And as soon as I thought that, I got so sad because that the police officers near me at 9:30 at night, that's not a big deal for me. My white brother is with me. That same situation that I felt safe in, it made me want to cry because I've heard so many stories, and I'm sure both of you have either experienced or know people who've experienced that same situation. First off, you wouldn't have been in that situation. The same way I know not to go out at night by myself, y'all know not to go out at night, which is so awful, and I'm so sorry. And that just goes back to the funding needs to change for the police, but also the training needs to change. And that is a system where anyone, not just a young white girl with her white brother, can feel safe, but anyone can feel safe. You see a police car and you feel safe. That's how it should be. It shouldn't be, just feeling emotional because I'm so sorry, and it's just a system that needs to change.
No, I thank you for being aware. Let me say that. I don't want you to fear the police. Would I have been outside walking around? No. But I don't want you to fear the police either. So I thank you for your honesty and for acknowledging. And I know white privilege has been a trigger word and people don't want to hear it. And it's not a blanket excuse, but to acknowledge it and to be known, you're part of the solution versus part of the problem. So we've given our viewers a lot to think about, and a lot to discuss and disagree with and agree with and research. So I'd like to present, if you have and you want to learn more and you would like to research and do your own about racial relations in the United States, I want to give you a couple of resources. Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. If I mispronounce that, I apologize. I read the book. It's amazing. The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. The book is better than the movie. The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Amazing. You will not be able to put this down. The B-Side by D. Watkins. Very real, from an English professor who lives right there in the middle of Baltimore. And it's wonderful. If you're more of a visual type learner, The 13th on Netflix. The Innocence Files on Netflix. I Am Not Your Negro on Hulu. Baltimore Rising on Hulu. The Uncomfortable Truth on Prime Video. And You Belong to Me on Prime Video. This list is by no means complete, but it will get you started on a path of research to seek and discover the truth about race relations in the United States. Tim, you want to close us out?
Sure, I'll close this out. That's no problem with me. I had a fantastic time. What about you guys?
Absolutely. I learned so much from you guys every time I talk to you guys.
I feel so honored that I get to be a part of these conversations and learning and getting to talk with you guys.
I know I enjoyed myself, and I hope you enjoyed yourself too. In closing, everyone, I want you all to remember a quote by James Baldwin. He said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." So come face it with us again next month when we talk about Black history.